Yo. Today I'm giving a response to a debate over the resurrection between Bart Ehrman and Justin Bass. Not real familiar with Justin Bass. I know Bart's got some fame because basically he's a Bible critic who's an atheist, and that gets him on. He's got he'll show up and debate whoever or whatever. He's got a high rank in his university that he teaches at. So, essentially that's a good way to make money right there. But I've always found him interesting. If for anything, he actually went to Moody Bible Institute, and my father went to Moody Bible Institute either about or exactly the same time. It's kind of hard to know because, I mean, my dad doesn't know him, at least not here 50 years later. And, neither would Bart probably. I mean, maybe he might, but I don't bear enough resemblance to where he would know him from me. If he ever knew me, I mean, it's, whatever. So, nevertheless, um, when I look at this debate, I want to kind of hit a couple points. First thing is that, a lot of Christians, they don't know how to deal with this stuff. They're easily intimidated. Um, they want to be, good, and sometimes good translates to some people as submissive, like I'm doing what I'm told. So when people come authoritative to them, they just don't know how to react. So, um, Bart here kind of pushes a little bit. And one of the things that he does in his argumentation, I saw another debate where he was arguing about the historicity of the gospel, um, which that debate was pathetic because he was taking on a Catholic, and Catholics are by nature not believing in inspiration. I mean, just pretty much at all. But anyhow, so yeah, Ehrman is taking this guy to task, and he's basically saying, like, as a historian, how are you going to measure up to history? Well, let's deal with something called the truth. Okay. Now, Bart Ehrman is not a historian. He doesn't have degrees specifically in history. Um, None of them. Everything he does is what we call textual criticism. Now, does a critical mind play a role in history? Sure. But there is absolutely nothing making him more of a historian than any Christian apologist. Because a Christian apologist also has to study history. And as a text critic, Ehrman is following a naturalist worldview with metaphysical decisions, thus making it religious. Okay. It might be, religiously negative, but it is religious. Okay. So, as he's going about his debate, he's saying that this is what a historian is. Well, that's baloney. you know, Not only because he doesn't know history enough, but like because, you don't have an atheist tradition going back to the ancient historians. Okay, the ancient historians, guys like Herodotus, were not naturalists. Okay, and obviously Josephus was not a naturalist, or um, even the guys who were more kind of liberal from the Jewish perspective. Philo was not a naturalist. And so, you have, these worldviews, but atheism was not intellectually respectable. Probably should still not be respectable, but it was not at all respectable. There were a couple guys, what we call pre-Socratic philosophers, who tried atheism out. Not very many of them. I mean, less than a handful, but they tried it out because they had debunked the idea of mythology by means of the pantheistic, polytheistic worldviews. And when they had debunked those worldviews, they thought, well, maybe everything is material and everything's just made of this material, and, we're just the products of material. But the problem is that that is a faith. How do you know what's material and what isn't? And to this day, it's still a faith. But at that point, it was a real problem, and so they didn't believe yet. They didn't have the faith in the laws of science, But if there are laws of science, who wrote those laws? If there is knowledge in this universe, then what has conceived that knowledge? Because knowledge is a concept, you know. What is making the universe behave in law? Why is gravity always working? You're like, oh, it just is. Well, if it is, then why is? And we can make a system out of these things. That's how we establish technology, because we have relied upon a body of knowledge. So there is knowledge in the universe, and knowledge is a concept. So who conceived the concept? Um, Philosopher Leibniz really focused on this. His form of cosmological argumentation. He kind of mixes a little bit of ontological argumentation and teleological argumentation within it. That's pretty neat. So, Bart Ehrman is not a historian. He is a critic. He imposes his naturalist worldview. He thinks that's the standard of history, but that's not the standard of history. He needs it to be the standard of history because he doesn't want history utterly debunking his worldview. Okay? Because it would. If you just look at the observations of the past, they completely debunk some of these theories of prehistory that no one ever recorded. But it is not a necessary foundation. And a couple times he does get cornered on it, to be fair. And so, he's like, oh no, anything's happened, but there's an issue of probability. Okay. Now, I think when I get a little further in, I'll show why that's debunked. And it was debunked in Bass's argumentation, but could have been a lot more heavily debunked. Justin Bass, as I said, I don't know a whole lot about him. He does kind of seem like a Gary Habermas disciple, what I call the minimal facts onlyism. And, to be fair, I don't think Gary Habermas operates on only minimal facts. Wouldn't make giant books. He's been bragging about this 5,000 page book. But no, he doesn't operate that way. But there's this idea that, like, hey, let's just find all these basic things of agreement, and we can kind of move the goalposts a little bit once we find agreement. I think it's a useful strategy, but the problem is that you don't want to overemphasize it. It's kind of like a lot of apologists, they want to use the jab. They're in their intellectual boxing match, they just want to reach out and just hit a little bit here, hit a little bit there. And the problem is that you're not knocking somebody out, and you could get yourself in trouble with that. And so this is kind of what happens, is that Bart is really fighting these guys with one hand tied behind their back. It's easy, because they're stuck on these things. And so, like, Bass gets fixated in this debate on the issue of how the gospel historically took off and everybody's lives were changed. And I think that Ehrman was able to pounce on that because the audience are not fellow historians. So he doesn't properly, Bass doesn't properly show them how the logic works. And so Ehrman just kind of makes a straw man and just runs with it. Straw man is because everything is popular, therefore. But what was he trying to say? Well, when we're talking about the resurrection, um, it was the central doctrine of Christianity, and it seemed to convince everybody. And people who were losing their lives over this doctrine. They were willing to bet that Jesus rose from the dead and that they were going to rise from the dead through him. So they believed in him. And why would they believe in him? This is the issue. Especially, a lot of non Jews would end up believing because of this. Why were they believing? Why was all these people willing to die if this is just something goofy, if it wasn't convincing? So, I think, and later I think he said it a little bit better, or he said, like, if there's smoke, there's a fire. So we've got smoke all over the place. And if there's smoke, there's a fire. But there's a lot that's lost. And, you know, he just really didn't connect all the dots properly, in my opinion. So, for instance, it's not just the fact that it was popular. It's the fact that people were willing to die, and most specifically, the people who knew better, or would theoretically know better, was the apostles. And the apostles were willing to die for something that if it was a lie, they would absolutely know that it was a lie. And they were all willing to die alone, separately, for this belief. So how do you get everybody to behave that way to their death without any influence upon the other? Um, so they claimed to have seen the resurrection and they were willing to die for it. Another thing is that just really goes out the window is the empty tomb. Bart Ehrman's theory kind of sounds like a massive hallucination theory, and I think he tinkers slightly, but it's really ultimately that. I mean, ultimately, it's just, we thought we saw it. They thought they saw it. We thought we saw it. So it must be. Well, if that were the case, the Jews, who acknowledged Jesus as a historical person, would simply have gone to the tomb. And the tomb would not be empty. The tomb would be sealed and the soldiers would be there. If the apostles had had a hallucination, they wouldn't say, "Oh, now I'm going to pay the guards to lie." Right? And by the way, if they had all this money to pay off the guards, wouldn't they have just paid off the judge so that Jesus wouldn't die in the first place? Okay? There is an empty tomb. And that empty tomb could be spotted. Why? Because it was near Golgotha. And not only was it near Golgotha, but it was in a luxurious garden, which had a giant cistern. Now, what happens is that this argument gets tainted because there are two locations, and one location is owned by the Catholic Church, and every church that seems to be sacramental in nature, okay, they all claim that this was this Hadrian's tomb, and that Constantine's mother, who is such a devout Christian, even though Constantine himself was a devout pagan, okay, but she was Mother of the Year apparently. She decided that she'd go off and she could just pick it after 300 years, just this perfect archaeological knowledge, and go to Hadrian's tomb, which was a pagan tomb, and Abacadabra. Okay. The truth is, there is no garden tomb there. They've literally just got a tomb with no evidence. Oh yeah, well they put the church up around it. They got rid of everything. Okay. But then you go around the hill a little bit, and they excavated the garden tomb. The garden tomb has that first century cistern, the giant first century cistern, right there. Okay. You have a little place called Skull Hill. What would that translate if we translate to Latin? It would be called Calvary. Okay. You got a Skull Hill. What would that be in Hebrew? It would be Golgotha. Okay. There it is. There's a picture, and the cracks make it look like a skull. Okay. Right around the corner. Okay. And here they are, and they've excavated this, and you have a missing stone. And they found a giant disc shaped rock, and it turned out that that was an ancient stone, and it matched this tomb called the Garden Tomb or Gordon's Tomb. Okay. And it matches perfectly. There had to be a great stone, not just any stone, but a great stone. And this is a 9-foot diameter stone that fits right in. Now, I think there was some markings later, but the problem is, as I said, the rest of the stuff all pans out. It's all ancient first century. And scratches from somebody later on does not prove that this thing is not ancient. So, just as much if you put graffiti on an ancient castle, it still would be an ancient castle, even though you'd spray painted it 30 years back. Okay. Yeah, there's no, there would still be a tomb, and Jesus would be in it. And the Jews would have known it. And they would have mentioned it in the Talmud. Okay. And they wouldn't have to kill so many people off, which kind of gets a little taxing after a while. Who moved the stone? Okay, where did it go? So, yeah, the empty tomb. I don't know why he didn't mention this. Also, critical scholars mentioned the fact that the women went to the empty tomb. They knew about it. They knew where to find it, and they were the first ones to talk about it. And because that culture was sexist, they would never just up and accept that testimony. Therefore, the testimony was there because it really did happen. Okay, the empty tomb makes this obvious. Okay, you didn't have to get lost in the weeds about how effective an argument is that you're not explaining properly to your audience. The onlyism problem. As I said, it's not bad to use minimal facts, but it is bad if you act as if, and Bart was able to jump onto this thing. If you act as if that's all you have, then you have a problem. And Bart jumped on that. The truth is that when we talk about resurrection, it wasn't just any resurrection, and it was just wasn't any normal human being. There was records of people who saw the sky turn black when he died. There were Chinese and Korean astrologers who had noticed that a star appeared around the time of his birth. And there were reports that there were high messianic expectations. There's been some that seem to be legitimate records of a Chinese king around that time recognizing the star that would bring the Messiah. And of course, we know that scriptures say it was the kings of the east. So you have the star, you have the night sky, okay? Then you also have about 300 prophecies, okay, that are all pointing to this man. They're all pointing to Jesus. Okay, we've got the historical figure that's been agreed upon. Bart didn't have a problem with that because he actually has to deal with the evidence. So, there's other things with the gospel that they just presuppositions which get very irritating after a while because they just assume things without actually proving them. And this is the go along to get along mentality. Oh, I can be debonair, I can be cool, I can wear my cool polo, just like your polo. Like, no, no, no. The dates, the um, the early liberals started making up a new history, and this is obvious. I've got I'm reading a second book now. I've read a book before that where liberals will admit that the Gospels were understood and seen at as historical up until 200 years ago, till they started revising history, which is a problem for Bart Ehrman because he's wanting to keep it according to the orthodoxy of 200 years ago. Say, well, that wasn't really history. Well, of course it was history. Now, it's fair to not come off with the same interpretation as the historian, but it's not fair to throw out observations, especially just because you don't agree with the person observing. So, he made a comparison to Joseph Smith and Muhammad. Now, these are not um, accurate. And I mean that because the debate is over whether Jesus rose from the dead. These two guys didn't rise from the dead. Rising from the dead is a physical miracle where it physically happens in real life. That's why the tomb is very important. But he's talking about, well, what happened here and how you interpret. Okay. Well, you can disagree. You can see something spiritual and say, well, no, 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 that was mental. That person lost their mind or whatever. But only if you agree that it was an observation. So you go to an observation. If you think it doesn't make sense, you can disagree with the interpretation, but not the observation unless there's some proof that the person was lying or that there was a cover up or something. But you actually have to find that evidence that happened, that the cover up happened. Because we're focused on what is the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that there is no satisfactory um, natural explanation outside of the resurrection. If Jesus swooned, well, he'd still be stuck because there's a 3 or 4 thousand pound stone right in front of him. And if the apostles had conspired, they would have got whooped by the Romans, period. But also, even if they were somehow able to get past that, then they would have gotten nailed. And the Romans should surely have been able to find the body. And as Jews, we talk about this evidence. We have, and I didn't mention it here, but we also have the Shroud of Turin, and we have the Sudarium of Oviedo. the things that were wrapped around Jesus at his death, Jesus would have been naked and bloody if they had stole his body. So wouldn't Jews have been kind of shocked handling bloody dead bodies? Bloody dead naked bodies? Like they're going to run around with a bloody dead naked body? How does that work? And, to Bass's point, when you have billions of people um, worshiping God as a result, if it were botched, this won't work. It's because it's making sense that people are, turning around to it. So here, Paul, you talk about the 500 witnesses. The reason why that's important is because Paul anticipated an audience and said, hey, audience, you know that this happened, and you can find out because several hundred of those people are still alive today, and you can hear their testimony. And where did Paul get their testimony? Paul was persecuting the church. He was going door to door on his way to Damascus. And, one or two neighborhoods, and it's easy to find up to 500 people living in one or two neighborhoods. Let me talk about an unbeliever. Josephus said that they claim to have seen Jesus rise from the dead. And it's part of his famous quotation, which everybody hates, because it's just too good. That the Jewish historian admitted that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, that's okay in Judaism. There was about 30 people claiming to meet Messiah within 100 years of Jesus. And they were still considered Jews. You'd probably be considered wrong, if not most of them wrong. So what do you do with that? Well, they did not believe that Jesus was God. But Josephus in that passage didn't claim that Jesus was God. So there was nothing, no reason to get rid of that passage. Especially because it was in about every version, except for an Arabic translation. The problem is that Josephus didn't write in Greek. He didn't write in Hebrew. He wrote in Latin. Latin is not connected. Okay, there's no reason for him to have written in Arabic to the Romans at any point, especially as big and voluminous as this was. So there's a witness to the resurrection. And most people, if they had seen that he had risen from the dead, would go along and say, okay, he rose from the dead. You can talk about it. Who am I to say? So, those were just a couple things. I'm sure I could get deeper if I really tried hard, but it's like, just wanted to go ahead and give some comment on that because I know that some of these things, if the performance is not good, people are like, oh no, what happened? Well, what happened is that Bass decided to tie his hands behind himself so that he couldn't really fight back hard enough. He can fight a little bit. One thing though is like kind of it irritates me. He started start bulldogging a little bit, and Ehrman did a little bit himself, and he also got some drama in there. But that's not, to me, that's not winning the debate. That's trying to intimidate your opponent. Hopefully, he'll say something stupid. But it's not getting to the truth. So how do you win a debate if you're not getting to the truth? I don't think that you are winning the debate. You might win a popularity contest, but you're not winning the debate. So, catch y'all later.